Good evening, class, and take your seats. We got a hell of a topic this week, and something probably overdue in terms of subject matter. Today we will discuss a battle mech that is not the biggest of them all, or the best, or the most technologically advanced, or even the most dangerous. In fact, this may be the most average Joe of battle mechs. Today's story isn't about the greatest of them all, but what is frequently overlooked in inner-sphere warfighting, that which is good enough. For this lesson is an exploration of that constant gamble in weapons development, wagering everything on perfect potential outcomes versus accepting good enough for now and leaving things well enough alone. At the center of this thesis, we will discuss one of the timeless classics of inner-sphere warfighting, the mech designed to be good enough for most things, the champion of the everyman, and not to mention one of my very favorites at 70 tons of righteous fury, the mighty Warhammer. This story, and the many stories which orbit it, will tell the tale of not only the rise of the battle mech, but the timelessness of near-perfect design. The end result is a machine, a simple machine, that has become in many professional circles, and in my humble opinion, one of the ultimate weapons platforms under 7 million C-bills. And pardon the delays, my extracurricular activities and penchant for thoroughness have made this a more difficult endeavor than I had ever considered. In my research, I found much that influenced the development of the legendary Warhammer, and in turn, I plan on visiting most of these interesting places in the timeline to give you a fuller understanding as to how and why the Warhammer is what it is today. To start, I will need to discuss the great mistakes in arms procurement that began the Warhammer in earnest. However, to tell this lesson fully and correctly frame it, we need to wind back a bit and briefly revisit the age of the warship, itself the end result of a rampant arms race. The age of the warship began with humanity's push toward the stars. At least, that's what the history books say. I feel it really began with McKenna turning his guns on Terra in 2315 to remind humanity that maybe they should get their collective shit together before going on to make the rest of the galaxy more interesting. By Tentavel, there were so many warships in service that they had become the cornerstone of all military planning and thus were the prime cause and solution to most geopolitical issues. The so-called Age of War, which I'm sure you're now well familiar with, and the subsequent Age of the Battle Mech have already been covered in the scope of this lecture series as they directly relate to the development and production of first and second generation battle mechs. However, I'm going to briefly go over the transition between the Age of War and the Age of the Battle Mech in very broad strokes to highlight a problem in weapons procurement directly related to my thesis. A thesis that suggests, regardless of era, weapons procurement is governed mostly by people who can't, or never will, see a battlefield of their own volition, all trying to spend as much of other people's money as is humanly possible. For those unaware or late to this lecture series, I'm a cynic, and in very broad strokes, the Age of War was the last great pre-mech arms race. It was a savage era. It was populated by the occasional crime against humanity measured in the gigaton. Each great house, with enormous strategic fleets and their attendant building schemes being governed mostly by the N-squared law, each held truly terrifying firepower. But they had forgotten a few key lessons about strategic deterrence, and so things often escalated. As it turns out, nuclear weapons are one of those things you can't just undo, for those of you curious. Tentavel gave us the Ares Conventions. The Ares Conventions prevented strategic weapons from being the first-round pick in any war, and so militaries that have been built around warship-centric warfighting found themselves ground down with no tools left and no major force multiplier to make any significant headway in their vast, now neutered arsenals. From a desperate need to innovate within the limited scope of war governed by the Ares conventions, we get the battle mech. From the Mackie onward, it can be safe to say that war had changed. The politics were largely the same, but the way in which the great houses competed was entirely new in the aftermath of the Ares conventions. War was no longer a strategic feel-good measure expressed through fleets and being an aggressive posturing that, well, occasionally boiled over into a thermonuclear game of tag. The advent of mechs and the Ares conventions to govern them meant controlled, sustained combat that suited the nations of the Inner Sphere, as it prevented each and every war from becoming de facto a catastrophic escalation of force. Again, mostly, nobody's perfect. Both the great and soon-to-be great powers had embraced this new standard of conflict, a way of war governed by the limitations of the Ares conventions, and fought predominantly on terrestrial battlefields. Warships alone no longer governed conflict. They now mostly gave the armies a ride and afforded a strategic reserve in case things went off the deep end. The earliest mechs were at first a radical idea, made manifest by the vast military-industrial complexes born out of the Hegemony Research Alliance Department. Aggressive hegemony technology policies such as the Cameron Blacklist and Mother Doctrine further reinforced this notion of technological supremacy above all others, and force parity with any successor house despite the limitations of territorial holdings. To achieve this notion, the hegemony determined that they would pay any price to ensure absolute primacy of First Nation among nations, and thus the military-industrial complex made sure to collect that money. And though I have gone over this doctrine of carefully protecting industrial knowledge earlier in this series and its direct effects on the balance of power, I draw your attention to the subject at this juncture once more to posit a humble opinion. Such a stranglehold on weapons R&D didn't stall mech development and innovation as the directors general of the Terran hegemony had intended. Instead, it drove one of the most competitive arms races the Inner Sphere has ever known. Students of sociology might know this effect as keeping up with the Joneses, or a classic case of envy between peer nations now constrained to limited means by which to maintain a strategic edge. And, in a tale as old as humanity, the great powers of the Inner Sphere saw what they didn't have, and with greed and avarice pounding through their veins, they rolled up their sleeves and said, "Fuck it. If they won't sell them to us, we'll make our own." Or in the case of Canopus, with blackjack and hookers. And they did. And so, mechs became the yardstick of military might as quickly as they could be produced. Having mechs was a must, and soon enough, having better ones, more specialized ones, was absolutely critical in the development of mech warfare doctrines. War planners wanted anti-aircraft platforms, fire support platforms, heavily modifiable frontline combat platforms, and of course all the joy and comfort that those production jobs bring to a constituency meant that it was an easy procurement program to justify for most military procurement authorities. The age of the battle mech brought near constant fighting, but hell, they resulted in a tremendous economic boom for those with the ability to reap the benefits of equally pervasive large-scale weapons investment programs. War, sometimes, is just what business needs. It's hard to justify an infrastructure program, but if you relabel it as an emergency security measure for public safety, well, that's an easier sale to make, doubly so when it provides a generation of your constituents with fat paychecks. That's not to say mechs were a hard sell for the actual warfighting armies of the Inner Sphere at all. Warships were a necessary step to expand holdings and patrol held territory in an age before the HPG network. However, the naval arms race had stagnated conflict into whoever could apply maximal force the fastest before your opponent could respond. Unless it went nuclear, that is. And that's a hell of a genie to put back in the bottle. As it turns out, glass sand isn't worth much in the strategic sense. There's no real KD ratio in war that matters if all you inherit is dirt. With warships being easier to make and repair than, say, entire habitable planets, there was a bit of a problem here. Warships also had the problem, as stated, of being less useful after Tintaville. Warships are great if your problems are strategic, but strategic weapons have limited application in anything other than a full-blown war. And while major invasions are kept at bay with the implied threat of a strategic response, border wars and proxy wars fill that gap neatly. And in those conflicts, it's difficult to justify the use of full-blown theater-scale nuclear ordnance and what may not even matter long-term, let alone over what is notionally your soil. And I promise this all ties in. So why bring up warships again? Well, I need to talk about warships as one of the biggest investments of manpower, resources, and research in the inner sphere to talk about the next subject. Warships, planet-killing ordnance, and any other flavor of grand investment for state defense, to include battle mechs by the age of the battle mech, are enormous gambles. And while mechs have long since replaced warships as the weapon of choice for interstellar slap fights, warships and their attendant building programs serve as a useful test, which can demonstrate easily how bad a problem can be when you blindly gamble everything on being the best. That being said, you're about to learn more about the bad side of military procurement programs than you ever wanted to know. And this lesson is key, as it shapes all that follows. Let me tell you a bedtime story, one about greed, audacity, and incompetence. While the name Baron is known to us, and is certainly a noble title going far back into antiquity as records allow us to see, the warship class named the Baron was anything but noble. The Baron was a destroyer-class vessel initially designed, bought, and built for the Terran hegemony. It was supposed to be a next-generation, incredibly expensive, groundbreaking destroyer hull design conceived and built during the height of the massive naval building programs at the end of the Age of War. It should have been a shining example of the hegemony's craft, its scientists, and their vast bodies of knowledge. Should have been, but wasn't. By 2515, the keel was laid and actual construction had begun after a lengthy design, bidding, contracting, and governmental committee approval process. Because building a bunch of something very expensive requires a lot of fucking money. And that, of course, attracts only the finest interests from various parties, all wanting a slice of the pie. The objective of the class was to provide a new generation of destroyer to outmuscle the other states of the inner sphere. This was an absolute requirement, as the hegemony was small, industrial at its limit, and had to build qualitatively better forces in order to have any chance to stand against the ever-increasing industrial bases of their peer states. This was ambitious, as historically the terrestrial navies of ancient Terra, with substantial quantitative challenges of manpower or equipment, also attempted to overcome these deficiencies by building qualitatively better examples of equipment for the task at hand. In short, if you couldn't beat their numbers, you made certain your shit was top tier. At least in theory. But national defense isn't that sort of game. Most nations accept the idea that to have peace, they must prepare for war. This requires massive investments in the future that may or may not turn out to be completely useless when the time comes to test if your preparations are sufficient or were even wise in the first place. And so industrial nations must dance a line in military procurement. They operate one military on a daily basis, and then they buy and build another for the next war, or the one after it. It is a constant competition of brains, sweat, and blood to build a better killing machine before your neighbor does. This balance of procurement must measure the tremendous gulf between day-to-day military operations as practice in fact, and how planning and procurement now will influence and shape the fortunes in any future conflict. The very threat of war, for those who've seen it firsthand, is enough to make such massive future investments part of every nation or aspirational power's military budget. Whether this is just madness, paranoia, sound preparation, or just good old-fashioned graft. Whatever you call this, just know, to the military-industrial complex, it's fucking payday. At 1.628 billion C-bills per hull, the Baron was an enormous investment for the already massively overextended hegemony. The Navy said it was critical for defense, critical for future generations of shipbuilding, and likely the age-old adage of, if we don't build it, the enemy will. And so the hegemony approved the design, and they started to build the goddamn thing. I'm not talking build two and see how they work, and then operate them, and then with lessons learned, build the rest. I'm saying full immediate production of a complex yet completely untested hull that had never been successfully integrated with any of its components. On paper, it was an innovative weapon system being built on faith without even a scale, model, prototype. Take note, this is called foreshadowing. At 545 meters in length and armored with the latest, and not to mention the then most supremely expensive in armor, improved ferro-aluminum armor plate, itself a precursor to ferrocarbide armor used today, the Baron was an imposing warship, at least notionally. As designed, it had 29 naval-grade lasers, 8 naval autocannons, and a White Shark missile tube array capable of laying out reminders of great power theory in 50 kiloton doses. It had a KF drive, it had all the best technologies which we now consider largely standard in warship design for destroyer-class vessels. It was bold, fast, and innovative. It was a potential game changer. It could and should have heralded in a new era, a new standard of ships, and the hegemony would have had all of them. But, as great as it was on paper, reality is another fucking thing altogether. Equipped with the latest and greatest as dictated by the needs of the government, which the naval staff had demanded and ordered built as soon as possible, certain mistakes were overlooked, or chalked up to the favorite phrase in the military affairs world when shit doesn't work right because nobody actually tested it in an operational environment because they were too busy buying shares and doing cocaine about it. The phrase is teething troubles. And friends, let me tell you, if a weapon can be said to have teething troubles, the Baron was missing half a set and ordering corn on the cob for dinner. Soon after the keel was laid, workers at the yard found virtually nothing to be as it should. With master shipbuilding plans in hand, naval architects found that, with systems either poorly conceived, designed, or produced and then shipped to the yard for assembly without second thought, the lack of any significant components integration testing resulted in a cursed project from the get-go. At first, most of the issues surrounded the then revolutionary engines and its attached power plant. In a warship whose whole point of existence is rapid power projection, having a shitty power plant is kind of a big deal. Doubly so when the warship is intended to be a fast response vessel capable of sustaining high thrust for long periods of time. Engine faults alone caused such delays in building the goddamn things that they weren't even put into full-time service until many years after their intended introduction date. These were laid up during construction for years while engineers tried to figure out what the designers, military planners, and admirals had been smoking. By the time they were actually built, the designers and officers who had wanted them had either moved on, retired, or been promoted. This is called making your abject failure somebody else's problem. When it's a matter of debt or money or time, that's one thing. When it's a cornerstone of your national defense, it's something else altogether. As it turns out, building something new, revolutionary, and game-changing at any cost is actually quite hard. It's harder still to try to build, prototype, improve, and modify the design for mass construction while simultaneously manufacturing the damn thing. But to try to fix design while arguing with a distant naval design committee who thinks they did no wrong, procurement teams who are only interested about the dollar amount, and naval officers who seem more interested in buying, building, and parading rather than operating a military in its intended capacity, well, that makes things pretty fucking difficult all around. Crazier still is every time you try to stop production and address faults by closing the yard in question until everything is correct, the budget office throws more money at the problem, and thus the circus continues. As it turns out, operating a good, competent military isn't just a skill for generals. It actually requires talent across a wide variety of disciplines. Most of all, I find it crippling that many generals forget that true leadership requires the wisdom to listen to people who are actually smarter than you, and the foresight to plan for darker days. But what the hell do I know about leadership? I'm just a mercenary. At any rate, it's not exactly the sort of thing anyone should endeavor to do when trying to build a national defense program. That is to say, dream up an impossible product and then build it without even seeing if you can actually make the damn thing, all the while hoping you fix the problem before anyone notices. Then again, the military affairs crowd typically making decisions in these cases have struggles with concepts like object permanence, let alone the difficult considerations of strategic warfighting outside of a classroom. Weapons procurement is a gamble, and sometimes you lose your fucking shoes. Or in this case, you end up with the Baron. But its story is not done yet. I've only talked about how badly it was built. So, some years later, the now quasi-operational Baron class was brought into the Star League Defense Forces with now corrected engines that vastly diminished its ability to maneuver, accelerate, and hold combat speed. I need you to understand why that is a problem. One moment. Let me check the dictionary here. Merriam-Webster's 2831. A good enough dictionary for people who could read. Let's see. Destroyer. Noun. Definition of destroyer. One that destroys. I can agree with that. 2. A small fast warship used especially to support larger vessels. Okay, so the SLDF had a warship, a destroyer, which by definition was a small fast warship used especially to support larger vessels. A destroyer that was big, slow, and couldn't keep pace with friendly fleets or chase anything it was supposed to. As a destroyer, at 1.6 billion C-bills per unit, and that's before re-engineering the damn things to actually work, and not even work as designed. And they made these. In fact, they mass-produced them. So, because of the cost or political sensitivities, rather than admit they were useless and use the sad state of the destroyer fleet as a basis for building something better with coalition support, the brand new SLDF instead smiled, nodded, and said thank you, before immediately parceling them out to the successor states as a goodwill measure. Oh sure, they kept some in the hegemony to remind people that yes, ships exist, your government is keeping you safe, but the bulk of them went to the successor states who wanted some freebies for joining up. Yes, I know they're not called successor states yet, but that's what we call them today, and I'd rather not get into that just yet. Which I'm very sure the successor states were happy to get. Hand-me-downs from the hegemony were prized assets, at least until that point. It is my opinion that yes, a warship can be so bad when it's free that it permanently sours relationships and makes client states wonder why they ever bought into a Star League in the first place. Whether or not this is a pre-Ameris domino or cause for the Star League to be undermined from the very beginning by bad faith actions under the guise of charitable donations to client states is perhaps a fuller discussion for another time. But I will say this. If they were that embarrassingly bad and effectively obsolete by production that they were shuffled off as door prizes and political favors, were they really all that terrible in the grand scheme of things? I mean, after all, how bad could it be? Well, as it turns out, the answer to that is pretty fucking bad, and this next part of the story is pretty fucking great. So, A weapon that cost 1.6 billion C-bills ran blindly into services because someone a generation ago thought it was a good enough idea to go all in on them, now in the hands of a Navy who was adamant they would make do with what they had. Surely, this would not be a disaster, right? Considering the universe we currently live in, I think you know the answer. Now, as this is academics, I must prove my points and begin to tie all this together into why we don't, or more accurately, shouldn't do these things. And for this example, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite underdogs who, time and again, typically reminds nations in short order that just because you have an army doesn't mean you should use it. A nation that measures go away by the megaton. A nation that thinks recoil is a repetitive sports injury, and that the difference between mine clearing equipment and infantry clearing equipment depends entirely on who's driving and in what direction. Yeah, this is a story about the Taurian Concordat. By the late 2570s, the barons were still in service. They were on frontline duty with generation after generation of expensive upgrades, fixes, and standard operating procedures created and made to correct as many of its defects as possible. And this isn't unreasonable, for these things had cost a lot of goddamn money, and they had to be paid off. And as governments will run any acquired asset until it's no longer serviceable, this is not at all an unexpected outcome. Unfortunately for the Baron, its supporters past and present were going to have their moment in the sun, or at least a federated one. The 2570s are interesting to note, as the relatively new Star League was trying to bully the periphery into joining up, coercing them into becoming Star League territories. Politically, that meant the periphery states could look forward to new and exciting forms of unwarranted solicitation, taxation without any sort of meaningful representation, and repression from a distant and uncaring government. It also meant the wonderful opportunity of joining teams with a government they fundamentally didn't understand, care for, or even notionally support. Understandably, most periphery nations said no thank you. Or, in the case of Van Zandt, what in the cinnamon toast fuck is a Star League? As it turns out, people who had gone that far out into space did so for a reason. Mostly, they were dissatisfied with things in the inner sphere, or at least the core worlds of humanity. Generation after generation, they had boarded their ships, kicked their heels free of Terra, and embarked to a new life, far from any comforts or notion of so-called civilization. These people were, by then, no longer Terrans, and did not think fondly of where they were from. They did not look back and measure their success against the core worlds of humanity. They made their own path and were set to defend it. They didn't want anything to do with the Terran government, its successors, or the states they birthed, and they had gone far out of everyone's way to do just that. And like most folks were keen on keeping on what they'd made for themselves, the Taurians had founded a competent military for the purposes of keeping assholes off their lawn. This military trained and drilled hard, realizing that sovereignty on the ass end of space was only guaranteed by their will, hard work, sacrifice, and if necessary, their own blood. When they realized the Star League wasn't going to politely back down, they prepared accordingly. They didn't beg, they didn't really negotiate. They dug in, put their helmets on, and waited. When the Star League said this was for the benefit of all, the Taurians replied with the diplomatic version of, "No thank you." And when they saw forces marshaling on their frontier, they opened their playbook and went to work. Case Amber, as it was called, was the first time the SLDF really had to fight a nation that wasn't nominally, or supposed to be, under its control. Worse, this was a conflict against a periphery state that was plainly tired of their shit and prepared to do something about it. The SLDF assumed their navy and their military was of higher quality, and should that fail, the substantial numbers advantage would make the war a decided outcome. And so, I need to illustrate a difference in naval doctrine. The SLDF Navy was based on the Hegemony Navy, which at the time favored advanced technologies, complicated designs, and innovative building practices, all in an attempt to keep power parity with the surrounding states. Those states had since become allies, if at least notionally, and as such, the SLDF Navy inheriting these vessels found themselves with a navy that was fantastic on paper, and yet completely untested in the only way these things ever fucking matter: actual war. War that they had not fought in a very long time to the fullest of their ability to do so because of the Ares Conventions. And yes, while the Ares Conventions were now suspended under the Starleague Charter, their impact on the intervening years of conflict was imprinted clearly on their doctrines, shipbuilding, warfighting, and battle theory. Which, I should point out, these were conventions that the Taurians had never signed. These were conventions the Taurians had never observed and didn't trust, mainly because shortly after the Capellans signed the treaty, they gassed the Taurians. And as it turns out, most people tend not to forget shit like that. And the Taurians, well, this is their symbol. And such is their symbol because we have trained since our founding day to stack bodies like fucking cordwood, so if you insist in fucking around, you will most certainly find out, doesn't fit on the money, and probably sends the wrong message to international investors. The Taurian Navy was designed by people who were making do with less, hell-bent on keeping scary strangers out of their backyard. It was a frigate navy mostly, favoring speed and firepower to get the job done, or run and alert everyone else if it couldn't. The SLDF Navy at that time was the Grand Fleet designed to look good and provide a strategic feel-good measure to theater-scale conflict. It was built on the principle that it would never be needed, and therefore only needed to match the latest idealized version of what a fleet was, with every new generation of leadership and appropriations. The Taurian Navy was no such thing. It didn't live in military academies or in advertisements about next-gen anything. It had one objective: to defend the Taurian nation, and was principally designed to fight the SLDF and anyone else who got ideas on free real estate. To illustrate this, let's look at how the Taurians built their standard warship at the conflict. This is the Concordat. It's a big frigate. It can sustain twice the acceleration of the Baron. It carries 500 tons of armor that is not fancy and simply very hard. It is designed for easy damage control, easy field refits even in lower technology-based facilities, and can operate independently of other vessels for extended periods of time. It boasts overlapping fields of fire, ranging from mech-scale lasers and LRMs to a full complement of naval-scale lasers and autocannons. In many ways, it actually outguns the Baron. Functionally, the Concordat frigate is an anti-everything cocaine-fueled death machine designed to speed into action wherever the Taurians need it most, and to be multi-mission capable as an orbital bombardment platform, troop transport, strategic weapons platform, and to be honest, there was nothing better than the Concordat-class frigate for skirmishing with pirates. And in this sad case, these pirates looked an awful lot like the SLDF and their new friends. So the Taurians made a multi-mission capable heavy frigate that's faster, better, more reliable, robust, and deadly than its larger state opponent. Naturally, this solution has to cost a fortune, what with the Taurians having a fraction of their industrial base. Actually, it didn't. First reason being is it wasn't sophisticated at all. It was just good engineering and off-the-shelf components. That, and I heavily suspect the Taurians punish incompetent people making decisions at a strategic procurement level with actual prison sentences instead of allowing them to meddle in affairs. And so, by building what they needed instead of what they desired, by listening to people who fight actual fucking wars instead of listening to self-actualization concepts floated by war planners who don't fight and never will, by correctly identifying what they required to defend their realm instead of opting for the biggest, the best, and the most expensive solution, the Taurian Navy beat the SLDF to deployment of its peer vessel by 2 decades. 2 full decades of use, training, education, tactic development, and establishing an actual operational readiness rate before the Baron left the slip yard. Also, the Concordat's engines worked the first time they did a shakedown cruise, because instead of trying to rewrite the book, they took what worked and accepted it as good enough. Amazing concept, right? Taurian naval doctrine centered around these now very proven ships. They weren't just another line item in the budget. The Taurian Navy made a recommendation for shipbuilding. The shipbuilders built it, and then they used them. It was a ship designed for a purpose, and put into that purpose as reasonably as any periphery nation could. And so the tiny Taurian Navy stood off against the fleets of the SLDF and House Davion allies in what would be one of the greatest defense-in-depth campaigns in history. The small Taurian Navy managed to lure the SLDF and the Davions into an absolute shooting gallery. At Tintavia, the Taurian Navy destroyed 12 warships, including 5 Barons, which were too slow to run, too sluggish to close, and too weak to fight back against the heavy frigates of the Taurian Navy. This tiny navy kept the Davions and the SLDF on the back foot through 10 waves of invasion. Not 10 battles, 10 waves. That is to say, landing troops and then getting stalled and then sending for help and hoping the Taurians don't show up to murder them as well. Even as the ground war slowly turned against them, the Taurian military time and again kept the bulk of the SLDF, itself drawing reinforcements, to barely hold onto their conquests, and it kept them on shaky footing for the duration of the entire war. The Taurian Navy made things dicey through asymmetrical warfare, hit-and-run naval raids, and clandestine resupply of blockaded worlds through an excellent fleet and good naval warfare doctrine. This allowed the state to fight the Star League for so long it became an embarrassment, and potentially another crisis of government. Conquering the Taurian Concordat took the SLDF from 2576 to 2596. 20 years. 20 fucking years of fighting the Taurians on both land and sea and across the vast Gulf of Stars. 20 years because they had to chase a navy around with absolutely inferior ships they had no choice to use because they were bought and paid for by war planners now likely dead, retired, or too busy counting oceans of money to fucking care. 20 years with the fear that every time the SLDF moved an inch, the Taurian Navy would show up, drop off troops, and lay out another 1,000 megatons or so of go the fuck home. So why bring up the Baron, military affairs, military procurement, strategic planning, the reunification war, and the divide between an idealized military and the one you operate on a daily basis in a discussion on the Warhammer? Well, for one, I think this is clearly established by now. The customer has no idea what the fuck they want, and the builder is fine with that, so long as the bills are paid on time. Things like the mullet, jorts, shoulder-fired contact-fused nuclear weapons, tetraethyl lead, chlorine trifluoride, spray-on hair, Agent Orange, DDT, and certain automotive products do not exist by accident. People, meaning the customer, absolutely ask for these things, and typically they know not what they ask for, nor care what happens afterward. And in this case, when the customer is a government official, and a government procurement official at that, and the amount of money is essentially infinity, bad decisions and their impact can be measured in lives, borders, and flags. Wrong choices in these cases can be the end of a nation, and quite messily so. So thanks to poor choices, you now have a $1.6 billion turd in something like the Baron, which again is $1.6 billion per hull at the point you lay the keel, and many times over again for fixes, upgrade, repair, modifications, and maintenance. By refusing to acknowledge poor choices over successive generations and careful modification of mission scope, you make a mistake like the Baron for future generations to curse, and then, sadly, to die for. The Baron and the Reunification War did more to close the chapter fully on the warship age than anything else in my own humble opinion. Bad weapons are doubly cursed when their chief design assumption is that there will never be an actual test of their intended purpose by a peer military power. The Baron stood as a reminder that if you bought something bad and continued to excuse how awful it was by pouring all the money in the world into it, you might just get embarrassed generations later by a non-peer military force that knows what they're doing. And that's why you have the age of the battle mech. Battle mechs are a far cheaper bet, requiring far fewer resources, and if, heaven forbid, you end up with a turd, you can quietly make it go away in years instead of decades upon decades of refit and refurbishment and replacement required for most naval programs. To most, it was clear that warships had had their moment, and when needed, couldn't change the fact that war needs somebody to go down to the planet and beat people to death until the flags change. And so mechs became very attractive as investments for future conflict. Additionally, all that cash that went into naval building programs were now starting to pour into anything other than ships you can't use, or, in the case of the Baron, fucking shouldn't. These virtually unlimited defense funds were scooped up by the brand new mech industry, which said, hey, we're cheap. The ultimate lesson in the Baron, naval procurement, and its impact on mech design is thus: you can put all the money in the world into something that is supposed to be innovative and world-changing, but it is sometimes far wiser to make something good enough and leave it well the fuck alone. Like the Concordat, the Warhammer was conceived and produced all the while the Baron was still having its teething troubles, and certainly bore the lessons learned from it, even though it was a mech and certainly not anywhere near as expensive as a vast ship production program. Military procurement programs, regardless of intended use, were shaped by disasters like the Baron, and if not the Baron, any number of follies committed in the name of state security from the then recent past. In the military-industrial complex world, lessons like the Baron were a dime a dozen, and while perhaps one of the most prominent, cases like the Baron were on the cheap end of fucked up decision-making. Rebuilding a portion of the destroyer fleet is one thing. Rebuilding armies and nations, that's another. The Warhammer stands apart in this era, as it isn't trying very hard to be a trendy next-gen warfighting platform or anything remotely approaching the cutting edge. The Warhammer is not a high-end product of high-tech all-or-nothing engineering or an attempt to push the envelope of what is possible or to even redefine what conflict is. Unlike its many peers in this early, formative era of battle mech design, it wasn't trying to be a game changer. The Warhammer stands out for a very different reason. In an age of excess, it is the end result of an engineering approach called good enough. The Warhammer is, above all other things, a celebration of practicality in an age of true excess, of wiser minds taking full heed of the expensive and costly lessons from humanity's past and directly applying them to solutions in the present. And with that in mind, the story of the Warhammer begins with a series of barely known mech designs and a company eager to get their piece of the big time in the aftermath of the Mackie and all that followed. So let's talk about Starcore Industries. With lessons like the Baron playing out in then recent, or worse, then current memory, the military-industrial complex was split. Lessons like the Baron demonstrated that going all in might not work, or worse, might inspire a peer power to develop something that actually did, for a lot cheaper and far sooner than your ultimate weapon was even ready, if it ever would be. Sure, you could go all in and make sweet money building weapons that might not work for states that might not be around who ever use them. Or you could keep your feet on the ground in this realm we shall call reality and do what you can to get by, or merely survive. This was an age of rapid arms proliferation, and competition was rampant. You built better weapons platforms in a gamble to be the first, the best, or the greatest, or you made parts for those who did. A number of companies went all in to try to make the perfect battle mech, the next Mackie, or at least something different to offer the great houses of the inner sphere. Many companies tried their best to ally with one house or another, all trying to play their part of the great game. But, to tell the truth, Starcore was not the sort of company that had ever gone all in on anything, except for fucking money. Starcore Industries was one of those companies that had profited handsomely from the Mother Doctrine. In fact, Starcore had become wealthy and influential enough to maintain not only a headquarters within the hegemony itself, but had cleanly rebranded with satellite headquarters soon enough in every major power in the inner sphere. I point out satellite offices and local-friendly rebranding for a few very important reasons. One, Starcore was poised to sell any product directly to the customer as soon as they could come up with one, while avoiding any sort of serious scrutiny from the hegemony itself. Two, Starcore was positioned to see what each house's military was developing, fielding, and testing. If wise and patient, Starcore would see what was actually needed, and then exploit that need in the name of great and glorious fortunes. And three, which is perhaps most critical, it signaled Starcore's way of pushing forward into what was now the greatest era of mech proliferation in history. This was potentially the arms race of arms races, and they were on the ground floor. But rather than ally with a single house or a single interest, or go all in to develop a weapon that may never work, they played the entire field, and carefully so. Being partnered with each of the great houses and observant for anything that could print money, the company was very interested in the design and production of two of the earliest Davion mech prototypes, the Battle Axe and the Hammerhands. Little did they know, this specific interest from one of their satellite offices would change the world as we know it, or at least the modern concept of the heavy mech. Watching and learning what the customer wants by seeing what they desperately try to develop and build on their own is pretty smart. It's also free because you're watching somebody else fuck up and then taking the lessons home for later. I believe this is what the ancient Greeks called wisdom. The principle was simple enough and exceptionally low risk. Starcore would, through their satellite offices, offer a license to Gemini design products through their shell corporations. Did I say shell corporations? I meant alleged shell corporations operated by regional offices that were legally similar to but distinct from Starcore. There, now sue me. They could also, through supply chain integration and ingratiating themselves with the local governments, again through detached sister corporations and many layers of legal fuckery, observe the military-industrial complexes of their potential customers and competition. They could, without spies or subterfuge, with merely a handshake and a good suit, gain access to the highest levels of military affairs and take the pulse of future war planning. From this point of influence, they could offer their expertise and application of industrial know-how to actually solve their customers' problems for them. If the price was right, that is. The trick was waiting for a niche, then exploiting the hell out of it, which, with the way the arms race was going, they wouldn't have to wait long at all. The Davion's first indigenous design, the Battle Axe, came out a few short decades after the Mackie. For its time, it's a brilliant design worthy of study. Unlike many of its contemporaries, it's not a Mackie copy or a quickly built shitbox to make a few bucks. It was a platform purely for testing in many ways, acting as a prototype for further mech development, through the application of field study and limited deployment. It is also one of the earliest examples I can find of a dedicated heavy mech that doesn't make me want to throw things at it. Further, it was continually improved from prototype, field trials, and through multiple production run models as Davion's own mech engineers taught themselves what a battle mech is and what it can be with the right mindset. Over the course of its short lifespan, this 70-ton mech had its overall speed and maneuverability significantly improved, component weight reduced, and reliability problems tackled. It was primitive by any modern reckoning. Hell, the original prototype had a prototype power plant, but it was beautifully armed for the era. The weapon of choice for Davion was, at that point, the very best and latest in weapons, the PPC, which I can get behind. The Battle Axe had two of them, and even jump jets, and a full array of short and long-range missiles. Though the Battle Axe was imperfect, Davion engineers refused to give up and tried again. The Hammerhands was an attempt by House Davion to fix the Battle Axe. They had stretched the battle axe as far as they thought it could go, and with those lessons learned, they applied it in a second, vastly refined and arguably better mech design. While not a clean sheet redesign with something completely different, they instead kept what worked and discarded what didn't. This is also the mech that pretty much starts autocannon fever among some Davion pilots. It has 2 AC-10s. In 2459, that was a pretty big fucking deal. The Hammerhands was actually made with feedback from the pilots, maintainers, and officers who had driven or worked on the battle axe in order to make this successive mech a better weapon. Observations from its limited deployment were directly incorporated into its design process. Because Davion does that. Because yes, they actually care for the most part. And yes, that is what makes them so goddamn annoying. Every soldier has the right to complain. And amazingly, House Davion reads those complaints and then does something about them. All the while, Starcore watched and took notes while Ashinar, the state-supported and oldest founded mechworks in the Federated Suns, tried its hardest to show that it too was as capable as the hegemony had been. This development of actually designing useful products based on the failures of previous products while balancing the needs of the end user is rare in the military-industrial complex. Noble even, but rare. So if nothing else, let's give Davion a hand for being rational in this age of madness and then let them go back to being smug. Anyways, the Hammerhands was 75 tons to the Battle Axe's 70. It made significant improvements in not only the prototype that was the Battle Axe, but stands as a refinement in concept of what a heavy mech could be. The Hammerhands is not remarkable by modern standards with 2 AC-10s, 2 medium lasers, and an SRM-6. But it was exceptionally versatile for its age. With jump jets and a damn good engine, it was an exceptionally mobile warfighter. It was versatile and calculated to be handsomely priced if mass-produced. Most importantly, it was an improvement over existing products. The Hammerhands was later a testbed for early C3 systems and developed the value of network battle spaces in the field of battle mechs, which stands again as a phenomenal development and far ahead of its time. And from the shadows, Starcore had been watching the whole time, no doubt offering to help them with this evaluation project, as they were a company based in the hegemony, and of course had access to the very best in technology and engineering through its sister office. It was clear that Starcore smelled profit, and instead of waiting for the customer to figure it the fuck out, they jumped right in on a third design, drawing directly from lessons observed by the Davion field office and its partnership with the Davion military. The idea was, what if Starcore could take the hard-earned lessons from Ashnar's 2 pretty good attempts at making a heavy mech, refine it, and sell it to everyone so they could finally have enough money to stop caring about things like petty morality. And ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly what Starcore did. In applied engineering, there is one maxim above all others. Good enough is perfect. And while the Davions were lost in the weeds, nobly trying to figure out yet another iteration of an optimal perfect mech that may never be at whatever cost they could put on it, Starcore rolled up their sleeves, grabbed that idea, and ran to the fucking bank.
Mike, no.
What do you mean, Mike? No, you mean Mike? Yes.
No.
Rural schools are far different in terms of the way the kids act. A lot of them are more open to joining tabletop, but a lot of them aren't as, I would say they're not as loyal as those inner city kids will be.
I cast magic missile.
You fucking grew up playing tabletop in Texas.
I grew up playing tabletop in rural Texas, and you don't know shit until you hear an old Texas farmer come down into a root cellar with a ZZ Top beard and overalls. And he's like, y'all playing that Dungeon and Dragon? And we're like, yes, sir. And he's like, oh, shit, man, mind if I sit in? And then he sits down with his spit cup.
Yeah.
And is sitting there spitting backer. And he's like, all right, let me tell you this one time, man. I'm going to show you how barbarian throw down. I'm going to show you the strong hand.
Yeah.
And I was like, you know, that's why I love tabletop, because you've not heard a barbarian until he descends from like the wilderness. And he's like, hey, man, guess what? I don't care if there's Orc Champion or not. I'm going to bust his ass. And we're going to praise Palor up in here. I ain't afraid of no ghosts.
All right. I think you have pretty much all you need there, sir.
Starcore wasn't stupid. For lessons like the Baron weren't unique. Lessons like the Baron were horrifyingly plentiful in the history of the military-industrial complex. Lessons like the Baron were still playing out when Starcore decided to act. From being functionally aware of their surroundings, Starcore knew too well the reckless disregard desperate nations and clients exercised when it came to military planning, and that said programs were ultimately the doom of anyone foolish enough to embrace them. The way forward, they realized, lay in trying to do what their clients seemingly couldn't. Make something good enough, and nothing more. After borrowing a few ideas and concepts from Team Davion and then having their engineers figure out what Davion got right, the Warhammer was rapidly prototyped and slapped into serial production. It wasn't hard, of course. Starcore had the customers' years and years of tests, trials, engineering data, feedback, concern, committee study, and pilot complaints. They then took that acquired data and built something uncomplex, simple, robust, and reliable. To sell it, they didn't lie or promise the world. Where some products are launched with massive ad campaigns featuring scantily clad women, suave men, and well-spoken pundits on every major broadcast channel, Starcore just didn't bother with any of that. In fact, Starcore had this to say on the release of what would be one of the greatest mech designs in history. The Warhammer is a mobile mech with enough firepower to destroy or severely damage any mech of the same weight class or lower. That's it. Every part of that sentence made sense. None of it is contradictory, and none of it is open to vague interpretation. It was supposed to move, it was supposed to be a mech, and it was supposed to be, above all other things, good enough. That's it. You'll notice they didn't use the words revolutionary, groundbreaking, game-changing, future-proof, or next-generation warfighter in that description. That's because it isn't. Instead, it's a product that does what it says on the tin. It is a mech that fights and will probably win against any other mech its size or smaller because it's not stupidly made. The Warhammer isn't at all sophisticated, for none of its parts are really proprietary, and all of its components are easy to find and replace. That's because the Warhammer isn't designed to be a technological powerhouse. It's not designed to be the killing machine of killing machines, or be a future force multiplier, or cost 1.6 billion C-bills per gamble. I mean, fuck, it's not even designed to go that fast. But it is designed to be good enough. And friends, as it turns out, good enough in war is fucking perfect. The Warhammer as it rolled out in 2515 was more than adequate on all fronts, and certainly recognized immediately for being an unpretentious, uncomplex, reasonable weapon system that wasn't trying to redefine warfare as we saw it. Mind you, this is an era where mechs were new, and anything, no matter how stupid, was equally valid until proven otherwise. This was an era where warships were waning, and newer, vaster fortunes were pouring into mech design. Those who would go on to fail were pouring everything into the very best at any cost in order to buy an edge for the next fight regardless of the consequences. And in an age where everyone was trying to make the best, the finest, and the most at any cost, StarCorps made the Warhammer to be adequate. In fact, I believe StarCorps was just trying to make something good enough until the next thing came along to replace it. To StarCorps, this wasn't a flagship product. It was just another product. One of many. They had no idea how right they got it until many centuries later. At 70 tons, the WHM-6R is considered to be one of the best balanced weapon systems of its era, if not all time. It had 18 heat sinks. It could keep pace with what was the then standard maneuvering speed, and it was very heavily armed for that era. It had 2 PPCs, an SRM-6, 2 medium lasers, 2 small lasers, and because infantry needs to be reminded who's the stompiest, 2 machine guns. Because apparently they didn't hear you the first time. The Warhammer was one of the first mechs to be designed around this crazy idea of driving forward and shooting at the same time, to take advantage of both mobility and firepower simultaneously. That sounds normal to us now. Then, well, it was somewhat new. That's not to say the Mackie didn't try to do this, but, well, it's historically rare for your first successful weapon system to last very long past its original intended application. Because war isn't a sport that rewards second place. War is the sort of thing where there are winners, and there are parking lots. Something to note here. The Warhammer could accurately fire while maneuvering, and had weapons that let it engage at nearly every range bracket with reasonable firepower instead of leaning on one primary weapons platform and hoping it worked in every instance. This was a bit bold in this era. It was something designed to do all the things a mech could do up to this point, but better, and in a wider variety of operational theaters, and, arguably, cheaper. They accomplished this by making it as simple as possible, and uncomplicated as possible, while sacrificing none of its ability to be modified, rebuilt, and remade for whatever the client had in mind. Naturally, a very versatile weapon system with a reasonable purchase point becomes attractive. And, well, the Warhammer has been around for so very long, and has existed in so many variations, that I'm going to cherry pick a few, a bare few here, to demonstrate the various battlefield roles it has been slotted to fill, and how it did so in each. Keep in mind, this is a weapon system that has been in serial production since 2515. It is still relevant today. With the sheer number of Warhammers, Warhammer derivatives, Warhammer-based designs, and Warhammer rip-offs, it's difficult to say over the span of half a millennia what is and isn't a Warhammer for those purists out there. Needless to say, there are quite a number of versions currently out there, hosted by a number of client states and non-state entities which defy explanation, or are a diatribe on their own. The 6R we've talked about, it's the main production model and is typically what we associate with your standard run-of-the-mill Warhammer. That is to say, if we can even apply that concept to something made for 500 plus years without major interruption. The 6D was a refit, or rather base modifications of the 6R, bought by the Federated Sons. Yes, House Davion spent a lot of money on Warhammers after trying to make their own first, and then realizing they should just pay professionals to handle it. The 6D is an amazing upgrade to the standard model by doing something most pilots don't, sacrificing firepower for armor. The 6D removes anything that takes ammunition and replaces it with either armor or heat sinks. This is not only a great solution for a longer-term variable intensity conflict, but also logistically it's cheaper when you don't have as many weapon systems to maintain in your stable of mechs, and accordingly afford yourself less strain on logistics systems in a time of war. The 6K is a Kurita take on the Warhammer, which means it's half honorable and half weird. They decided to remove the ammunition storage for machine guns and replace it with armor. Instead of asking why their heavy mechs were exploding more frequently than anyone else using them at the time, they just removed the ammo. Surely not a training or doctrine problem that could have been corrected. Moving on. Capellans being Capellans though, they made the 6L, which they call the Hot Hammer, and it's both fucked up and cool in equal measure. Well, remember how they removed the machine guns so they wouldn't have explosions or incendiary problems? Turns out some design bureau in Capellan space maybe was only reading half their correspondence because they heard fire and explosions and said, "Yeah, that sounds pretty goddamn great," and made the 6L. The 6L is called the Hot Hammer because they replaced the machine guns with flamethrowers. They also call it the Hot Hammer because infantry tends not to work as well when it's on fire. It's also strangely a double cockpit Warhammer, which I get in an assault mech or a training mech or in a mech unit that requires both advanced piloting and advanced gunnery skills, but my gut tells me the second seat is for the pilot's own shadow, to ensure he doesn't run off with state property the instant he sees actual freedom and begins to desire it for himself. I still don't know if they ever solve the exploding problem. I'm pretty sure they have fun with it. The SLDF got wind of how great this new toy was and bought them by the shitload. When the Royal Division saw the standard Army Corps with a new toy, they demanded a Royal Division version. The 6RB is that Warhammer, and aside from being an incredible collector's item these days for being a surviving Star League Royal edition of one of the finest battle mechs ever made, it's a fantastic upgrade to the weapons platform. It replaces all the heat sinks with double heat sinks, all armor with ferrofibrous upgrades, and adds an Artemis 4 fire control system. It's not a total redesign, but it is still a very sexy upgrade. Also, if you happen to find one for sale, make sure to check the serial numbers. There are a lot of upgrade kits out there made to mimic an original Star League build, so make sure the numbers are matching, or just steal one from a museum. I'm not your dad. The C3 is something the Wolves Dragoons whipped up with clan tech, because I guess they missed home. It's got a clan skeleton made of Indo steel and an XL engine. It's probably one of the most expensive upgrades ever given to a Warhammer, but, well, the Dragoons are legend for a reason. It has double heat sinks, an ECM system, stream SRMs, a modern targeting computer, and extended range versions of all weapons. It's the one you want if you're looking to buy. or the one you copy if you're wanting to build. The 7M is the official variant for the Purple Parakeet, Free Worlds League. And if you're looking for a design that's the definition of reasonable enough for most war zones, the 7M is just that. In the magical Goldilocks zone of upgrade programs, the 7M is a part-for-part improvement on the original, with significant upgrades in firepower and durability. It has a reinforced chassis and double heat sinks to cool the dual ERPPCs. It has one machine gun and replaces the other with the LFN Lindblad shotgun anti-missile system. It also vastly upgrades the electronics, cockpit, and communication systems with locally available off-the-shelf components. Again, reasonable. Good job, Free Worlds League. You get a nod of respect. No, I'm not glossing over the fact I say reasonable and Free Worlds League in the same sentence. Look, from Kenyan Merrick onward, it's a complex subject. I'll get to them in time. The 8D I bring up because it's something worth considering. In 3066, Star Corps issued an official upgrade of the Warhammer, their first official factory upgrade in, let me count. 3066 minus 2515, 551 years. So I want you to think on that. What product can you make that will be sold unmodified, largely except for by the end user, for 515 years straight? Think about that. Then add in that this is a product intended for probably the worst environment we as humanity have the capacity to create: war. So let that sink in. The Warhammer, for many reasons, isn't perfect, but as time has shown, it is a goddamn good design. Also to note, we had a few succession wars and a big coup in between those dates that made absolutely certain that anything not reasonably reliable, fixable, and modifiable through a degrading industrial base and high-intensity conflict more or less stopped working and was forgotten about. For a time, anyways. Keep that in mind. The Warhammer 8D is also a partnership with another company we've talked about, namely for its power plant. The 8D has a GM280 series reactor and is clad in Duralex heavy armor. I point out the GM280 series reactor because based on my partial data, the GM280 series was made on Talcott. That is what was being made before we, glassed everything that one time we let warship strategic warfare run rampant until we ran out of warships. Talcott is also the place where the Blackjack was being refit for being, probably the most okayest thing GM ever made. Whether this was an intentional shot at GM by showing that they too were making good heavy mechs still, even after hundreds of years of hell, or that this was instead a partnership in trying to diversify its industrial reach, Star Corps made good decisions throughout the 8D's redesign. They did the smart thing and basically copied the Wolf's Dragoon's own take on the mech, then mass-produced it for public consumption. Some might call this stealing, but all's fair in love and war. The 8D is further noteworthy as an example of how to do business in the inner sphere. Just wait and see how the customer plays with your product, identify what are the most popular and desirable upgrades or modifications, and then sell it to them. That Star Corps was glacially slow in rolling out new versions of their cash cow shows a keen understanding of market forces, strategic thinking, and warfare doctrines of the inner sphere. Rather than chasing the bleeding edge, Star Corps assumed that tomorrow would be mostly the same as yesterday, and waited for the checks to clear. I also point out the GM connection here, as GM was the chief logistical support for the Wolf's Dragoons, helping them rebuild Outreach's vast industrial potential in order to gain access to proprietary technology, data, and information. Surely the connection between a Wolf's Dragoon's proprietary design refit of the Warhammer ending up in their industrial partners' hands is purely coincidence. Surely coincidence. Or maybe it's just the Star Corps way. Moving on, the 8R is another very common variant of the mech out there. Some people consider it the most common these days, but I find that's largely survivor's bias and deployment related in terms of what's currently available. That being said, the 8R is more vanilla than vanilla. It's uncomplex, reasonable, and most importantly, fucking cheap. With the 8R, you get the upgrades of the intervening years of technological discovery, or in the case of the Inner Sphere, rediscovery, after a certain telecoms monopoly decided to vibe check some weirdos from beyond the Inner Sphere and we took their shit in the process. Where was I? Oh yeah, always pay your bills. Alright, the 8R. It's a boring but common enough refit variant. It has ERPPCs, it has ER lasers, and is, by most considerations, quite survivable as evidenced by its current commonality. It's a good starter Warhammer these days, with a lot of room to develop a variety of Mechwarrior skills. The next series of Warhammers I want to discuss are what the Taurians do with them. Being a non-Inner Sphere power, their take on the Warhammer is unique, and began with captured variants being pressed into service. The Warhammer 10 and 11Ts are a refit of House Davion's 9D version, which I am nearly certain to say were acquired not only through commercial means. But hey, abandoned weapons are usually free, usually dropped only once, and you cannot convince any army in history that they shouldn't just take them home. The 10T replaces the targeting computer with improved jump jets because I think the Taurians prefer to handle things up close and fairly personal, or they just like to look the enemy in the eye when they tell them to fuck off. The 11T confirms my theory, at least to my satisfaction, by replacing the ERPPCs with snub-nose variants, ferrofibrous armor, case protection, and an XL engine. And as said, there are numerous double or twin cockpit setups for the Warhammer regardless of end user or original production specs, providing armies the option of having an excellent trainer, if not forward observation platform. Some of these double cockpit versions have notably allowed pilots to focus on their strengths, that is to say piloting or combat, while maintaining a high degree of situational awareness. By splitting pilot tasks, a Warhammer can outfight any mech in similar tonnage, at essentially twice the manpower risk for combat. Ultimately, the Warhammer is hardest to define through its many variants. The Warhammer has always been a blank canvas for any number of very stupid things you want to do with it. Unlike many other mechs, this isn't the exception, but the rule in Warhammers. Each house has its own variant, or four, and every mercenary organization has its own custom take on this venerable monster. And while it's not a perfect weapon system, it most certainly is good enough for most tasks, and the warfighting men and women of the Inner Sphere are only too happy to have them. There are variants for nearly every possible feasible application a mech can do. The clanners even refit them for when people get old in their society, so they can ride out and die like heroes from some ancient Terran epic, because I guess it's cheaper than a retirement home. Also, clanners are weird. And it's a great mech for just about anyone, as evidenced by the apocalyptically insane builds coming out of Solaris, such as the Lich, or even Natasha Kerensky's own wild ride. And while we've examined what makes a Warhammer, let's look at what makes it truly stand out. Let's examine and contrast it against its peers. That is to say, mechs designed and built within 2 decades of the Warhammer, to see what we can learn about its competition. Firstly, let's go to this guy. The guillotine, or if you want to make francophones angry, put on the Van Zandt accent and call it, well, the guillotine. The guillotine is an interesting machine. It came out at the turn of the century in 2499 and was the hegemony's chief heavy mech. It was, well, a heavy mech. It had a large laser, 4 medium lasers, and an SRM-6. It was mostly average and okay. Based on my evidence, the design notes suggest that it stands out for being exceptionally nimble, which, if war were ballet, would mean something. But war isn't ballet. War is, in fact, fucking murder. The legendary Thunderbolt, on the other hand, itself a timeless classic, rolled off the line in 2491. It's a common enough mech these days, despite advances in technology, and is a reminder of what a 65-ton mech should be. The Thunderbolt is a great mech, and stands easily alongside the Warhammer as a masterful weapon, crafted in a more civilized, if not truly wealthier age. The Koche, if I'm even saying that right, was a Capellan take on trying to make a heavy mech in 2504. It was fast but lightly armed. It had an autocannon and 2 medium lasers, on a heavy mech. It had decent armor, but only 10 heat sinks. By the Succession Wars, these things had thankfully largely faded into obscurity, where they belong. Against these peers, though, the Warhammer is measured against the cruelty and impact of 500 years of conflict. From the outer periphery to Terra, you can find Warhammers. From noble-born tyrants to jumped-up privateers, you can find Warhammers. It is no major exaggeration to think that whole campaigns, if not wars, have been fought and won with just Warhammers for this reason. It's a damn fine mech, and it's good enough for most things. That and it being cheap is why everyone seems to still have so goddamn many of them. When I try to evaluate and weigh the historical impact of most mechs, I can find a bare handful, a baby's handful of pilots who have made it excel where most others have made do, and were lucky, if anything, to survive. Prince and pauper alike enjoy its robust design, reliable performance, and ease of use. As a weapon system that's forgiving, easy to learn, and rewarding to master, one that has stood the test of time, of successive generations of warfare and battle theory, and remained a viable weapons platform throughout, the Warhammer has cemented its place in the heart and stables of Mechwarriors throughout the Inner Sphere, and well beyond. Further, the Warhammer's common usage allows us to examine a common mythos among Mechwarriors. The question of someone being a legend in a mech versus being a legend because of one. While imperfect and falling short for every battle task there is, and being middling in things like rapid assault without major refits, the Warhammer has been at the centerpiece of more history than most mechs could ever hope to be, because regardless of how bad things truly got, the Warhammer was always ready. I acknowledge fully that it is a perfect machine for a bare few legends, but most importantly, it is perfectly adequate for almost every person. It is a mech that has been proven, generation after generation, as an easy-to-learn mech with forgivable handling. It is the first in a series of classic designs later copied by every major power, as it stands, in my opinion, as the first hugely successful design built principally around long-range, reliable gunnery in the arms, intermediate weapons in the torso, and a mix of weapons to offer solutions for multi-mission operations while being reasonably inexpensive and fully within the reach of successor houses and private individuals to own and operate. The Warhammer is a pure gunfighter. That is to say, on paper, because Inner Sphere pilots, well, they don't read much at all. But opting not for fists or hands of any sort, the Warhammer is made cheaper and purer as a gun platform. There was no sense of compromise in its design like you see in many military procurement programs to appeal to the vast egos of those involved who dream what war of the future may be and place bets on the outcome, bets measured in human lives. The Warhammer is a design that said, this is what you need, Now buy it, or I'll sell it to your fucking neighbors. And ladies and gentlemen, everyone bought. But they weren't all happy. The problem with someone shoving a solution down your throat is that it can be a bitter pill. And frequently armchair generals will rise in these times to say and tell us all how to put things right. Because sometimes good enough isn't enough, and you want more. And here's where we'll look into what the Warhammer inspired from those brave souls who looked at it and said, I can do that, but better. The Thug was originally dreamed up as a replacement to the venerable Warhammer, or rather it was dreamed up by the Multex Corporation as a direct competitor. It's an assault mech, but a light one at 80 tons, and a vast improvement on the Warhammer in that it's better protected and being one of the first zombie mechs in history. That is to say, you can't ever stop it from shooting back unless you beat all the pieces off it and kill the pilot. It is worse than the Warhammer in that it is more expensive. It is also worse than the Warhammer in the sense that Multex as a corporation didn't have a plan for the apocalypse and didn't widely distribute their production facilities across the inner sphere. What this means is that by the First Succession War, those remaining in the inner sphere were mostly in the hands of one very militant telecoms company. The Warhammer 2C is basically a remix of the Warhammer by the clans, who built on the Able design and ended up with an assault mech. It's basically a Warhammer, but better in every way. It also costs 50% more than the standard Warhammer. It proves that if you throw enough money and resources at a problem, you can make a better but more expensive solution. The Warhammer 2C is a big, sexy bastard of a war machine, and had the Succession Wars not happened, I could see it very much being a natural evolution of the Warhammer with time. Then again, the clanners have a problem with history, and worshipping the Star League of old, and the Warhammer 2C is in essence a living avatar of that belief system. It is a very polished version of ancient history, presented as a very sanitized view of the past. In that sense, of whether it is a simulation or a simulacrum of what once was, that's your call. I'm not a philosopher. I personally think it's a worthy successor, and not all that different from the resurrection of old designs with new technology in the wake of Four Succession Wars. And then there's the Defiance, which, well, it's okay. You know those memes about how Steiners and sheer excess at the cost of, reason? Well, it turns out that stereotype comes from a place. And one of those places is probably the Defiance. The Defiance is mostly forgotten because of a small piece of history that perhaps I may go over in time. You see, there's this company called Defiance Industries, and they're somewhat the flagship corporation of the modern Steiner Mechworks industry. Well, that's an understatement. Defiance Industries sits on the biggest single-site mech assembly plant in the inner sphere after the fall of the Star League. That they're big is an understatement. They are Steiner big, which is a whole different thing. Their attempt to beat the Warhammer is the Defiance, which, well, it was a bold idea. The Defiance is bold. We'll go with that. It's 5 tons heavier than a Warhammer. It carries an LB-10X autocannon, 2 PPCs, 2 ER medium lasers, an SRM-6, ER small lasers, and a machine gun. It has double heatsinks. It has Indo-steel armor. It has a light fusion engine. It has triple strength myomer throughout. It also costs 15.2 million C-bills. So it is better than a Warhammer at some things. At the cost of 2.5 Warhammers, it still can't face roll the weapons, and it isn't anywhere near as versatile. Also, if you aren't Lyran allied, you aren't going to get it cheap. That's MSRP cost. Also, Defiance Industries kind of had a problem. They, played politics, and they played it poorly. So they got caught up in a Steiner political thing, and the Grey Death Legion showed up, and let's just say that Defiance was passed over for the Fafnir, which is another Defiance Industries product, just way bigger and cheaper somehow at 11 million C-bills, because Steiners build huge mechs and there are certain economies of scale in their favor. And as for Starcore Industries, well, their story gets pretty interesting. Starcore would go on to make a hell of a lot of mechs over the years. They're the guys behind the longbow, because they got tired of their customers fumbling at the idea of fire support and making compromises, so they just made a walking missile launcher. Before you say, yeah, but the Stalker, let me put this into some perspective. Well, the longbow costs 7.4 million C-bills and is 85 tons of murder that has 2 LRM-20s, 2 LRM-5s, and 2 medium lasers. The Stalker costs 7.4 million C-bills, is 85 tons of murder, and has 2 LRM-10s and 2 large lasers, 4 medium lasers, and 2 SRM-6. Now, some will say the Stalker is better. However, here's what's important. While they were figuring out how the Stalker fucking worked, the longbow was sold. The longbow predates the Stalker by almost a full century. So the fairer comparison is longbow versus, well, nothing. Yeah, while people beat their dicks in the dark, Starcore knew their business and sold fucking metal. Starcore are the guys who tackled reverse engineering clan stuff after the invasion to copy or at least emulate the Thor with their Thanatos, which then gave many Innersphere pilots their first taste of what they were missing with Omnimax. They were even part of the production and design team for the Stalker, the Sunder, and Avatar, among many others. They used their partnerships with each house to directly design and produce or jointly design and produce anything they could. They forged commercial partnerships to make licensed copies or piecemeal material for the various great and minor industries across the Inner Sphere. They endured because of lessons learned, and more importantly, lessons observed, implemented, and made correct with simple engineering. Starcore is the way to do business, and while far from perfect, serves as an example of how a corporation can outlast successive governments and the years of chaos in between, while continuing to stack money in the process. From the goddamn Black Watch to the Gunslinger program, from Natasha Kerensky to Yorinaga Kurita, from the SLDF to those wanting them to fuck right off and everyone in between, the Warhammer has been there. The Warhammer has been a constant reminder that while war may change, that technology can shape and reshape the political landscape. Some things are truly eternal. The Warhammer is older than most governments in the Inner Sphere. Many great dynasties are far younger than Starcore's accidental success. The Warhammer is older than the C-bill. The Warhammer was there when Star League rose and fell and rose again. Briefly, kinda, before some people confuse technobabble with religious doctrine. The Warhammer has been a steady seat for many a pirate king, dictator, warlord, general, war hero, and average grunt alike. The Warhammer is eternal. And if it serves as anything in history, let us say this with certainty. It is the great equalizer. The Warhammer has been outclassed with a progressive march of time, but never obsolete and never replaced. While imperfect and certainly limited, it is good enough for most everyone in most cases. The Warhammer is an example of military-industrial cooperation, not competition, and not short-selling something as a quick fix or an empty promise. The Warhammer is a break from the idea of selling the customer a prototype and desperately trying to fix it as you go before the customer finds out and hauls your ass to prison. The Warhammer is rugged as hell. It is the definition of stable. And you can find parts for it fucking everywhere because Starcore Industries is not a bunch of people who think that every nut and bolt they make is proprietary. In fact, Starcore doesn't fucking care what you do with a Warhammer once you bought it, because at that point, it's none of their fucking business. And for the people who cry about whether this or that design is better than the Warhammer, please know that the very best designs, the most incredible engineering solutions, and great projects mean jack shit without a proper test. Where so-called legends, like the Stone Rhino, celebrate conflict with participation trophies and endless mountains of what if, the Warhammer actually gets shit done and has stacked bodies for 5 fucking centuries. It is a weapon system with the distinction of being uncomplex, uncomplicated, and yet superbly refined. The final lesson in the Warhammer is this: better engineering isn't about solving a problem, but doing so smartly. Better engineering doesn't require 1 million proprietary parts limited to a single application. Better engineering favors simplicity. It favors ease of manufacturing, ease of maintenance, ease of modification, and repair. Better engineering doesn't stand the test of a single event, but the broad scale of time. We celebrate ancient engineering for still standing despite the passage of years and the scale of human savagery. We celebrate military engineering by looking at the tool in question and realizing, after deep consideration, that it is good enough for now. And in that way, above all others, the Warhammer is truly perfect. Yes, by modern standards, the Warhammer is old. By Mechwarrior standards, so am I. Perhaps that which survives is not a measure of best, but frequently good enough. All right, that about wraps it up. Class dismissed. At any rate, let's get out of here because the shotgun pogo tournament has rented the room and, well, they make a mess of things as everything. Okay, here they come. God damn it.
Hey, Discount Dan here, and let me ask you something. Do you like money? Do you like making fast decisions which lead to money? Do you like explaining to strangers in smoky bars where you got that neat face scar? Well, have I got something for you. Discount Dan presents the new Detroit School's Pretty Good Pilot and Mechwarrior Academy. There's a lot of jobs out there in the world, but none is better than Mechwarrior because it's the only job where you get paid to be a professional bastard and qualified asshole. Not to mention, with the constant state of paranoia, fear, and suspicion these days, you won't have to wait long for your big chance. Here's how it works. You give me your money. I mail you a Discount Dan patent pending training box, and before long, my Mechwarrior Mobility Associates will transport you to your new home. Soon, you will be subjected to the best training that money can buy anywhere in the periphery. That's right. I'll teach you hard to learn Mechwarrior skills like heat training, cold training, night operations training. I'm Greg Roberts, and I was an accountant, and Your name is Killfuck Soulshitter, and you are here to deglove Capellans. Bam! Instant war, criminal cred. I'm not. I have a collection of bonsai trees. I made a mistake. Whatever you say, Mr. Soulshitter, nobody will doubt your might now. Why are you taking my real credentials? And just like that, A new hero is born! Unrelated, if you need help in a war zone, and not in a win the war way, but more in a hold them off until your real army shows up way, hit me up at my brand new business, Discount Dan's Pretty Good Speed Bumps and Casket Sales. Or my other new enterprise, Discount Dan's Haunted Empty Stairs Portrait Gallery. That one is a real hit with the media. At any rate, time is money, and I've pirated enough of this broadcast to know I'll not making it. So just remember, I'm Discount Dan, and I will always take your money, guaranteed.
From the makers of Merchant of Menace and Steiner Coliseum, Shakespeare in the Park, comes the newest interpretation of the Bard's timeless tale. On ancient Terra, in Scotland, a plot is hatched.
Dismayed not this, our captains, Macbeth and Banquo.
Duncan Fisher as everyone in Duncan Fisher's one-man Macbeth. You've hired me to fucking narrate Duncan fucking Fisher. Jesus Christ. I'm a fucking classically trained Duncan fucking Fisher. Jesus Christ. Fuck. God damn it.
Stay, you imperfect speakers, tell me more. By Sinel's death I know I am Thane of Glamis, but how of Cawdor? The Thane of Cawdor lives, a prosperous gentleman, and to be king stands not within the prospect of belief. No more than to be Cawdor. Say from whence you owe this strange intelligence, or why upon this blasted heath you stop our way with such prophetic greeting. Speak, I charge you. Witches vanish.
You don't say that.
But it says Macbeth, and I'm fucking Macbeth. I say witches vanish, witches vanish!
Winner of the prestigious Capellan Film Union Award for most injuries on set and least faithful recreation of source material, Duncan Fisher as Macbeth.
Hey, bruh, what's going on? Here's our chief guest.
Duncan Fisher as Lady Macbeth. For fuck's sake, oh, lump of fuck. They've completely fucked it. Are you serious?
If he had been forgotten, it had been as a gap in our greatest feast, an all thing unbecoming. Seriously, fuck that guy.
Duncan Fisher as Banquo.
Let your highness command upon me, to the which my duties are with a most indissoluble tie, forever knit. Fuck yeah, I nailed it. Nailed the fuck out of that.
Cut! Fuck! Fuck!
What's the matter, Mike?
We get one fucking take! We're almost out of goddamn tape! Fuck! Unedited, as was broadcast live through the Sphere for Charity.
Double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble.
All right, hurry the fuck up and boil.
The complete 16-hour experience, complete with mental breakdowns, drunken tirades, and several false promises to live better, along with some of Macbeth, half of Julius Caesar, in a scene from A Midsummer's Night's Dream, on accident. All for 99.99 sea bills.
I believe you, Amaris, but my awesome don't!
Macbeth, the Shakespeare that you just kinda did this and we couldn't stop watching. Please help pay for the extreme amount of damages he caused. 99.99 isn't all that much, and like you could invite your friends over and be like, hey, remember this?
Lady Macbeth, would you say I have a plethora?
I said I wanted to join the Wrecking Crew, and they gave me a Warhammer. I'm an engineer. I wanted to work for the reconstruction effort. They said I'm in the militia now and to enjoy the Warhammer. I'm somewhat terrified, but for the region, the salary is very competitive and there is a healthy band pay for the prize money. They give you the tools to be your own boss, really.
They told me we can't do slip and slide no more on account of the axle grease being too expensive, and Tim, God bless you, Tim, going to the street and his nipples coming off.
Okay, so get this. Our commander is a literal voodoo shaman type guy, okay? I thought it was all an act or something to freak the enemy out, but then he took the enemy's commander and, banished him to the Shadow Realms or something. I saw the guy's skeleton melt, and there were screams of the damned and whatnot. Other than that, Ray's pretty cool. Great fucking barbecue, though, man. Love my job. Love you, Ray. Please don't put a curse on me.
Eu me alistei pra matar vagabundo, mas o café aqui é terrível. Então achei o café bom, peguei. Agora é só meu!
I got shot 7 times, and they told me I was bad at my job. I asked for a medal on account of my sacrifice and my wounds, and they said, why? For getting shot like a dumbass?
Hvad fanden er et laver? Han satte jeg den er mægtig. Ved Odins krøllede dinglabs, nu skal den ondt løn med sig det en ting. Det her sted, det er grimt. Du kan ikke købe en økse, for det lugter af mjød, der selv kan gå hjem, og laden er lavet af norsk ulekyld. Hvad er det næste? Svenske røde pølser. Jeg tager hjem.
I joined Van Sant Militia to keep Van Sant free.
I bayoneted a guy in training, and now I'm the instructor because I bayoneted the instructor.
I was his competition for the job, and I got a Warhammer.
Yeah, I quit without notice and left the system of government property.
They put me through Cloud College. I joined Van Sant Militia as a stowaway of the dropship to escape Van Sant.
I think it's really strange, but it's not all bad. I am from Russell Hague, and I find this place, what is the word? Ah yes, charming and rustic.
I cooked a brisket once for the militia, and they drafted me. It's really not bad, but I'm not really a violent person, though I guess brisket is worth killing for when you think about it, so yeah. Nun meine Burger-Homo-Technik anwenden. Ah, hallo kleiner Mann. Hast du schon mal den Mond gesehen?
Hey, I told you this money was gonna be used for dumb shit. But you keep supporting me, so give an upvote for the man and pay him. Because I did.
This is the Van Zandt Department of Taxation and Graft. I regret to inform you that your dropship collided with a valuable early warning pirate radio and potato yield calculation satellite on the way here. As is custom, according to the books, you owe us its weight in silver and or 600 pounds of grade A beef. Wow, these books are old. I have no idea how that saves us a satellite, but it's the rules. Did I mention I'm the only guy working here? Seriously, there's nobody else in this department. I applied and got the job to find out it had been vacant for well over 180 years. Seriously. I tried collecting taxes here and they rebranded the office as the Van Zandt Department of Taxation and Graft, after which they tarred and feathered my house from the air. Our own Air Force did it. Like it was a goddamn duty. People clapped. Worst part is children following me around and pelting me with eggs, chanting, "Taxman, Taxman, Taxman." It haunts me. I know you took me in and helped me to get a new life after, well, fleeing that mess. I appreciate it. But this job is terrible. The fortifications here are so old. Your main command bunker on this planet was once a mighty fortification, which has since been stripped and turned to a grand old Opry visitor center, hotel, motel, restaurant, museum, classroom, bar, and mini-mall. Rest assured that your indoor mini-putt golf course is in good hands and absolutely resistant to any airburst nuclear blast under 50 megatons. What a goddamn... You know what, this planet is insane. But well, why is the ice cream so good? I'm not complaining, just frustrated. Look, just pay the fine so I don't have to bother you. I have so much to fix here. How do I sell urban infrastructure and defense fortifications to a population whose literal motto is mind your own business? Fuck me, this is thankless. I waved at a telephone lineman and he started shooting at me. But hey, at least we got people to stop stoning the man who successfully predicted the weather using science. Oh, did you hear the Marshal got his own TV show? You should really check it out. He's so proud.
Oh, wow. That was a recording of loons and shotguns at the local lake, courtesy of the Van Zandt Nature Preserve, with a gentle, distant mandolin. Just sets the scene there. Anyway, this is Van Zandt Public Radio, the only radio station still functioning after the militia blew the disco station up. Related reminder, the bake sale for new nuclear warheads for the Space Defense Artillery Militia, Company D, is this Thursday. So come on out and buy some delicious snacks and support our troops. I know I will. Now, in traffic news, the remnants of the invasion fleet are still coming down from orbit hot and heavy after our militia reminded them that if you want to fuck around here, oh buddy, you're gonna find out. So keep a watch on the skies, folks, because what lands on your property is legally yours. Also, stay off Highway 1 because the Road Services Department is out there cutting that mad cat apart and everyone's trying to get a piece like a fucked up Christmas dinner. Coming up next, we have a jaunty, if grim tune recently rediscovered by the Van Zandt State Militia Archaeology Project. You know, those knuckleheads who keep trying to dig up all the Star League era shit and fuck up traffic for the rest of us. Now, it is true that General Kerensky was a great man, but he was here for about 8 minutes a few hundred years ago, and as far as I know, the only thing he did on record was to complain about the local diner before he left. Oh, he had a point though. Mabel, look, nobody likes the soup of the day. You're not a bad person, it's not a bad business, It's just a bad soup. I mean, I hate it, people hate it, it's fucking terrible, and I'm gonna say it, because it's important that you know. Anyway, look, they found something grim deep in the earth, and I wanted to share it with you guys. So, hear me out. Back in the day, back on ancient Terra, it was blood sport, right? And they'd send children, to balance on spinning saw blades suspended over a pit of flames with chanting and screaming as far as the eye can see. While these kids went in there, they fought, they died for their audience. So this crazy, barbaric, metal as fuck culture has a theme song to celebrate these gladiators, which we've uncovered from magnetic tapes stored deep in the earth. And thankfully, we have a local musician to interpret this ancient song of death. So, Mr. Goat, was it? Yeah, take us away.
Crossfire, you'll get caught up in the crossfire. You'll get caught up in the crossfire. Crossfire. Yeah. Crossfire, you'll get caught up in the crossfire. You'll get caught up in the crossfire. Crossfire. Yeah.
Fucking Christ, this place is weird. Hey, what else you got?
I started my tour out in October of 49. I joined a good company thinking that things would be fine. Went out to war and was hoping for riches and fame. But I'm now back in Van Zandt and planners are squarely to blame. I guess you could say that my gunnery was perfectly fine. I did my part and I managed to just hold the line. The bastards kept coming, heading us time and again. I'm now back in Van Zandt and planners, they are to blame. I've managed to do my part and I just can't complain. War's always hell, but there's always canopus cocaine. I was invincible, never once gave in to pain. But I'm right back in Van Zandt and clanners are sure to blame. An urban mech is above everything awfully slow. And there's one thing about it that you probably know. An AC-10 don't do anything without good aim. So I'm square back in Van Zandt, and this time I sure am to blame. Roland was a warrior from a distant K-class sun, with an urban mech for hire, fighting to be done. The deal was made on Terra on a dry and windy day, so they set out for the war zone. Join the bloody fray. 65 to 80 in the third succession war, with the fingers on the trigger, knee deep in the gore. For nights and days they battled and left a trail of flames. They killed to make a living and to get to Solaris games. Roland the Irby jockey, Roland the Irby jockey. The houses bid to hire him, Capellans and the rest. For of all the Irby jockeys, Roland was the best. Until Comstar decided they wanted Roland dead. Those damn backstabbing Capellans blew off Roland's head. Roland, the headless Irby jockey, the Innisphere's bravest son. They can still see his headless body stomping through the night in the muzzle flash of a cut-down AC-10. In the muzzle flash of a cut-down AC-10. Roland searched the systems for that Comstar honoree. He found him in Canopus, in line at the HPG. Roland fired his jump jets and he didn't make a sound. He just smashed that Comstar puppet down into the ground. Roland the headless Irby pilot. 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 The eternal Irby pilot still wanders through the sphere. Now it's hundreds of years way later, and he's Comstar's greatest fear. Luthien and Misery, Palmyra and Tharkard. Clan of scum will feel the gun of Roland's urban mech and buy it.
I wonder how long we're going to have until people start screaming, when next MacTex? The day I stop making Tex Talks Battletech is, well, never. I've already started writing the next one, Jesus Christ, what is wrong with me?